Welcome back to the Priced Out Podcast. My name is Dylan, and I'm honored to be here with Senator Scott Wiener of 11th District. Scott, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much. So before we delve into the issues, I just wanted to ask you, how did you get involved in Bay Area politics, particularly related to housing?
Sure. Well, I grew up on the East Coast, and I moved to San Francisco in 1997 as a 27-year-old. And I think my first exposure to housing in San Francisco and the Bay Area was in August 1997. I came out to look for an apartment and figured it would be a normal, easy thing like it is other places. And I started going to open houses on a Saturday, and the line would be around the block. And this was the beginning of the dot-com boom, the last tech boom. And that was surprising to me. I was able to get a place. Then I, as a practicing attorney, I did pro bono work defending low-income tenants who were facing eviction. And I saw sort of the carnage of our housing problems, and the seniors and people living with HIV and low-income families who would tell me that if I lose my apartment, I have to leave San Francisco. I won't be able to stay here. And then I got very involved in neighborhood work and was the president of my neighborhood association. And I saw the other side. I saw projects that were within zoning that would have to go through years of process before getting approved. One in particular, the Whole Foods project at Dolores and Market, went through 50 community meetings, wow, even though it was 100% within zoning. So that I started to see, well, maybe I'm starting to understand why we have this problem. And when I was elected to the Board of Supervisors in 2010 and took office, I saw at City Hall what the problems were. People who were fighting any kind of addition of new housing, no matter how small, no matter how big, no matter how transit-oriented, whether it was for low-income people or market rate. And so over the years, I saw all sides of it as someone trying to find housing who was fortunate enough to have, enough of an income to afford housing, to what it was like at the neighborhood level, what it was like in City Hall. I saw the dysfunction, and then I started learning the statistics about how deep in the hole we are with housing. And so it really energized me on the board and then in the Senate to fight for more housing.
Wow, yeah, that's a problem that we've all had too, most of us young people. So we all know that there's a problem. Gavin Newsom said that we need 3.5 million housing units by, I think, 2025. Both politicians on both sides of the political spectrum agree, for the most part, it seems like. So what do you think have been just the biggest obstacles? Is it like local opposition? Is it just a general issue with zoning? Or what is the biggest obstacle?
Well, the good thing is, and you're right, housing is, most parts of housing policy are not partisan. And I serve with Democrats and Republicans, a lot more Democrats than Republicans, but and being pro or not pro housing, that spectrum is very similar in both parties. There are Democrats who are intensely pro housing, and then Democrats who are not, and same with Republicans. And so I have very strong allies who are Democrats, strong allies on housing, who are Republicans, and then people in both parties who are oppositional. So that it creates opportunities that this doesn't have to be, and nor is it a partisan issue. This is just a California issue and a problem that afflicts both Democrats and Republicans. And so in terms of what the main problem is, people like to scapegoat. It's tech's fault. It's having too many jobs. People just really blame things that they shouldn't be blaming. Really, we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and acknowledge that we as a community, we as a state, have created a system, have created the rules that don't allow enough housing. When people say, oh, Facebook or Google should be building housing for their employees, even if one agrees that we should have company towns again and have your landlord also be your boss, that we can have a conversation about that. The reality is Facebook and Google can't do anything unless their cities give them permission to build, which until very recently they refused to do. So we've created a series of rules and standards in California that I like to describe as California, well, I don't like to describe, but I do describe it as California's housing last policy, where housing is a low priority and where we have effectively decided that it's not a high priority to make sure there's enough housing for everyone who needs it. And that's what we're trying to turn around. So that manifests in a few ways. It manifests in zoning, where we have created a system in California of almost pure local control on housing until very recently. Right. And we would never do that for education or healthcare. We always want to have state standards, not on housing. We've told every city, you do what you want. If you don't want to build housing, we're not going to do anything about it. So we've allowed cities, including San Francisco and LA and cities throughout the state, to downzone and to ban apartment buildings, to say you're not allowed to build anything other than a single family home or maybe a 2-unit building. And even San Francisco, 70% of the land is zoned for only either single-family homes or 2 units. It's illegal to even build a 4 or 6-unit apartment building. That's true in much of LA and in cities throughout the state. It's unconscionable that we are banning housing in that way, and we need to change it. And that's just local control run amok. We have allowed the process to go on forever. So even if you're proposing, even if you have good zoning and you're proposing a building that's within that zoning, it might still take 3, 4, 5, 10 years to get the project approved with unending appeals and hearings and reviews and lawsuits. And that's a combination. That's not just a local issue. And yes, cities create a lot of local appeals and hearings. So that is a local issue, but it's also a state issue because we've allowed CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, to be used to undermine and delay and even kill pro-environment, dense infill housing near jobs and transit. So that it's a combination of decisions the state has made, decisions the courts have made in interpreting the law in a very anti-housing way, and decisions that have been made at the local level. And all of that has combined over decades and decades to stifle housing production in California.
So we saw recently in Huntington Beach, I think, that finally the state is taking action, and they're suing the city, I believe, because they weren't able to build enough housing. Do you think this is a sign that the status quo is kind of changing?
Well, I think so. And Huntington Beach is one of the most egregious offenders in the state. They're not the only one, to be clear. They are complaining that they're being singled out because there are 50 cities in the state that have just brazenly refused to comply with their housing obligations. There's actually a lot more than that. They do it in different ways, but you have to start somewhere. And Huntington Beach is a pretty egregious example. They just will not comply. And then they went ahead and downzoned to eliminate 2,000 units of potential housing, and they're going out of their way not to meet their housing obligations. So I want to give enormous credit to Governor Newsom and to Attorney General Javier Becerra for really, for saying very clearly, when we have a law in the books about housing, we're not just putting it there to pat ourselves on the back or to feel good about it. We're doing that. It's being signed into law. So that cities and people comply with it. And compliance is not optional. We need more housing and everyone has to be part of that. So the governor in particular, and I've known him for 20 years and he's terrific and I was happy to support him. And I knew he was going to be pro-housing and I was optimistic. I underestimated how quickly and how aggressively the governor would move to throw down the gauntlet for a pro-housing agenda. And so in his budget, the investments he's proposing to make, the support for cities to do good planning, and also the financial incentives to produce enough housing, it's all terrific. The statements he's made about zoning, very, very important. And now coming, out of the gate within a few weeks of being sworn in to sue one of the worst housing offenders in the state, that sends a very powerful message.
Wow. So I want to return again to Newsom's promise. So he's promised 3.5 million units by 2025, and he spoke about some financial incentives. How exactly will this be implemented? What are these financial incentives exactly?
Well, okay, let's talk about 3.5 million homes. We do have a 3.5 million home deficit, which is approximately equal to the housing deficit of the other 49 states combined. So it's huge, and we have to fill it. And I give the governor enormous credit for talking about that number, as daunting as it is, and for committing to closing that deficit. To build 3.5 million homes in 7 years is an audacious goal, and I'm a big believer in audacious goals. So hopefully we'll meet that goal, or at least make a lot of progress to it under Governor Newsom's leadership. And we want to make sure, and this is what SB 50 is about in zoning reform, that as we're adding 3.5 million homes, the last thing we want to do is just build more sprawl, which is what we've historically done, and just build, because we've allowed the job centers in the Bay Area and LA to ban apartment buildings, to downzone, and make it impossible to build a lot of housing here. People build further and further and further out, and what that means is we're covering up and destroying farmland and open space. We are building in areas where people cannot possibly use transit, and so we're clogging our freeways as a result. And we are forcing people, in order to find housing they can afford, to drive perhaps a 2-hour commute each way every day, which is terrible in terms of carbon emissions, for people's productivity, for their health, for their family life, when they're spending 4 hours a day in a car. And we're building in wildfire zones. And so what we need to do is make room through zoning reform to allow more housing in our urbanized areas, in our job centers, by public transit. And that means the Bay Area, LA, San Diego, other areas where it's just a more sustainable way of building. So that's what we're trying to lay the groundwork for that. In terms of financial incentives, the governor has suggested withholding state transportation funding to communities that are not meeting their housing goals. And I'm supportive of the direction where the governor is going. We have to be careful about how we do it. I do not believe we should withhold public transportation funding, because that funding really benefits low-income people who, frankly, are not the people who are spending 6 hours, shouting and yelling and screaming at planning commission hearings because they don't want a 4-unit building in their neighborhood. And so we don't want to hurt poor people. It also has to be a big enough hit, a big enough incentive, so that wealthy communities have to think about it. If it's not a big enough financial incentive, wealthy communities will just opt out and say, fine, we'll fund it locally. And you end up exacerbating segregation by only having housing being built in lower income communities.
Okay, got it. And I think I also heard that he was going to hold gas tax funds.
Well, that's what I mean, transportation funding. And I don't think I don't know that he's being specific to gas tax. Right. I think some have interpreted it that way.
Okay.
But there are a lot of sources of state transportation assistance.
Okay, interesting. So let's say theoretically a city doesn't meet its housing goals. Can we expect to see the same thing we saw in Huntington Beach? Is that the avenue that's going to be taken? Or will it depend on the community? I mean, maybe there's some communities that are worried about dislocation. Yeah. Will it sort of depend on where it is? How will it look?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the governor or for the attorney general, but I suspect that there will be more lawsuits. Again, that's speculation on my part. They haven't told me that. But you also, by filing a small number of lawsuits against some of the worst offenders, you can send a message to other communities. We don't want to have to sue a large number. You want people to just comply. And if communities start to understand that there are consequences to blowing off your state housing obligations, the hope is that we'll see more compliance.
Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your new bill you've proposed, SB 50. So unfortunately, last year, I believe SB 827 was shot down. Yeah. How has SB 50 kind of built upon the complaints of the last bill?
Sure. Well, SB 827, it was quite a roller coaster ride. We introduced it in January of 2018, a year ago, and then it hit the wall in its first committee hearing in, I believe it was early April. So it was about a 90-day process. And we knew it was going to be a hard and controversial bill for sure. I think we underestimated the just publicity explosion and the explosion of public dialogue throughout the state, that people were talking about it everywhere. It was the only bill I've ever had where people were stopping me on the street and knew the bill number, not just what the bill was. And it really just penetrated into the general population far more than I anticipated it would. That created an intensity that was very challenging to navigate. A lot of controversy. There was a lot of support and excitement about it, and then a lot of opposition. So it was a challenging few months, but I think it was a very, very positive thing, because we really helped move the conversation forward, where people were having we're having debates at the dinner table, as reported to me, about whether we should have more housing density near transit. And people were forced to, I think, grapple with the question of, when we say we want housing to be more affordable, what do we mean by that? Are we just saying it and we're just going to get upset and stomp our feet and wring our hands and get anxious about it? Or are we going to take the hard steps to address it? So I think it was a good process, even though it was a little bit chaotic at times. So the bill died, in the night. It was a brand new idea, essentially, in the Capitol. No bill like that had ever been introduced before at anything approaching that scale. And 90 days was just not enough time for us to build the coalition we needed. We started making some progress near the end with some amendments and expanding the coalition, but we ran out of time. So we took a few weeks to take a deep breath after the bill died, and we quickly started retooling for 2019. And so we spent quite a bit of time working with myself and my staff, working with our constructive opponents, the people, particularly progressives, who had concerns about displacement, so they opposed the bill, but they were not philosophically opposed to the bill. So we both my staff and I we went down to LA a number of times, meeting with some of the housing equity groups down there, meeting with local leaders, just gathering feedback. We had meetings in the Bay Area. We just really tried to get that feedback. And so when we reintroduced the bill in December, as SB 50, it had a few changes to it. At first, the bill has stronger tenant and demolition controls in it. We don't want this to be used as a way of just evicting people and tearing down housing to build new housing. So there are stronger controls there, and that's been very well received. We also, one of the critiques of SB 827 was, if you map it, because it was based solely on a half mile around fixed rail stops, quarter mile around high frequency bus stops, the geography was disproportionately in lower income areas. And there were plenty of wealthy communities included, but there were a lot that weren't included. So we did two things to try to adjust the geography. The first is to allow cities to delay by a few years implementation in sensitive communities, lower income communities that have high risk of displacement. And then we have a provision for so-called high opportunity areas that may not have great transit, but they have a lot of economic opportunity. They have jobs, good schools, et cetera. And so even though people may not be able to use transit much, they can drive shorter distances to get to work. So by doing those two things, we're hoping to make the bill more equitable. We also kept the late changes that we made last year that people may not have noticed. We got rid of the 8-story buildings that was causing a lot of unnecessary anxiety, because the heart of the bill was always the 4 to 5 story buildings, because that's wood construction. 8 stories, you're getting into steel construction, is much more expensive anyway. So we took that out. And we also provided that local heights will apply around bus stops. One of the concerns was, bus stops aren't always as useful as fixed rail. They can change. So we said, fine, we'll defer to the local height limit, but we were going to eliminate density restrictions. So if you have a 30-foot local height limit, that's fine. You can still build a 3 or 6 unit small apartment building there. But then around fixed rail, the height limit couldn't be below either 4 or 5 stories. And then we're still working through what the affordability requirements will be. So that's where we are.
Okay, awesome. Well, best of luck with that.
Yeah, thank you.
And when it comes to SB 35, your previous bill, which streamlined the development process for a lot of multifamily units, how has that been going in implementation? Has there been any success stories thus far?
Yeah.
And how has that been going?
It's been going quite well. I mean, it's always a little bit of a slow ramp up, because planning departments are figuring out how implemented, and you have projects that they want to figure it out before they go forward. But we're starting to see an acceleration. So of course the big SB 35 project is the Valco project in Cupertino. Cupertino, of course, is a city that has an enormous number of jobs, the Apple campus being just the most obvious, but has not produced a lot of housing. They are technically meeting their market rate RHNA goals, which is more about RHNA being broken because they've not actually produced that much housing. But they are streamlined for low income. So anything that's at least 50% low income is streamlined there. So Valco is a dead shopping center. Until recently, the only thing that was there was this one dim sum place, and now even that is gone. And it needs to be redeveloped. The Cupertino, there were divisions there. There were plenty of supporters, but there were a lot of opponents, and they were not able to ever get an approval for that project for years and years. So they are streamlined under SB 35. They have their permit now, although the anti-growth people in Cupertino are fighting it in court. And that'll be 2,400 units of housing, half of which, so 1,200 units affordable to people making up to 80% of area median income. In San Francisco, we now have, I believe, 3 100% affordable housing projects that have been streamlined under SB 35. There were just recently announced 2 Berkeley projects, 100% affordable housing, that are being streamlined. There was a mixed income project that is very contentious over there, by the Spenger's restaurant, the fight about whether it's a shell mound, so that's caught up in court. It's a very unique situation. The first LA project just moved forward. I've heard that, we don't have complete information, especially about the smaller projects, but we've been hearing about projects in places like Morgan Hill and other cities. So it's happening, and it's exciting.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
And now moving away from policy just a little bit,
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any advice for people our age, early 20s, people that are just moving into this area for work or have grown up their whole lives. How do we rent in this market? How do we sort of survive? Like, what should we do?
It's hard. I know it's really hard. And, so many young people who are just trying to get a foothold or are struggling, either can't find housing or have to have a lot of roommates or live not very close to where they work. And of course, if you're 22, 23 years old, it's a little easier just to have a bunch of roommates and it's all good. But, once you get to a certain age and you maybe don't want that situation anymore, or maybe you're getting married or you're going to have kids, it gets harder and harder and harder. And that's what this fight is about. We argue about these technical terms of zoning and CEQA and streamlining and ADUs and so on and so forth, but it's really about people, and it's about whether the Bay Area and California are going to continue to be a place where young people can get a foothold, where young families can actually stay and raise their kids instead of having to move to Denver or Portland or Reno, where seniors can stay in the communities where they've spent their whole lives, where people aren't pushed into poverty, and the cost of housing is a key driver of poverty. That's what this is about. And so, I don't have a silver bullet for what young people should do. I do know, there are people who are able to find housing that they can afford. Sometimes it takes a while, but I think continuing to be active and pushing to change this situation. And some people will say, well, it's going to take 10, 20 years to really fix the housing market in California. And that may be true in terms of having a really broad solution, but we know that even within a few years, if you accelerate housing production, prices start to come down. We've seen it even in San Francisco. We started to see rents come down. New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Seattle. It's still expensive in all these places, but we've seen you have even just a few years of good housing production, and costs start to go down. So I just encourage people to stay active.
So you would say a good way of kind of getting involved is just to participate in certain groups that are fighting the housing crisis or researching it for themselves. How would you suggest to young people?
Yeah, and the great thing is, it used to be 5, 6, 7 years ago when people would ask me, how do I get involved in housing issues? It was sometimes I didn't always have a great answer. But now with the rise of the YIMBY movement and all of its forms, and whether it's in San Francisco or Marin or Los Angeles or the South Bay or East Bay, there is an easy way for not just young people, it's mostly young people, but not only young people, but for people to engage with an organization where they can get involved in policy, they can get involved in showing up to advocate for specific projects at whichever city hall, where people can get involved in, if they want to, in political campaigns, ballot measure campaigns. It's just a really easy way for people to engage, and it's very inspiring to me that so many people in their 20s and 30s in particular, who may never have been active in a movement before, are now part of a movement, and asking the question, what's my future? What's the future for my friends? What's the future for my community? And it has completely shifted the politics of housing in the Bay Area and increasingly in California so it's not just, it used to be that when you would have public comment on new development, a lot of opposition, and the supporters would disproportionately be people who were involved with the development. And now you have activists coming out, and it just changes everything.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I appreciate the advice, and best of luck.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.